Welcome, dear listeners, to this new episode of Oliver the Time Traveler. Oliver and Isabella have arrived from Mars to Hollowbrook, and Oliver has shown Isabella around the town centre a bit. However, as the two of them are about to enter the familiar inn, they hear a voice greeting them warmly. So, without further ado, let's continue our story. Oliver stands at the threshold in the doorway of the inn, gazing in astonishment at Isabella as he hears the voice say, "Don't be alarmed, I'm a friend. I saw you coming." Isabella looks back at Oliver, who gestures with his hand, "Come, let's go inside." Without hesitation, Oliver walks further down the corridor to the room in the inn where he hears the voice coming from. Isabella follows Oliver, trying to peer over his shoulder to see who is in the inn. Oliver stands by the fireplace, which is burning, with Isabella beside him, and they see a man sitting at a table whom Oliver had indeed encountered before in Hollowbrook. Oliver speaks first. "Good afternoon, this is, I believe, the second time we've met, isn't it?" The man smiles at Oliver and Isabella and says, "We've seen each other more often than you might have realized." The man continues, "My name is Ed, at least that's what my friends call me. My real name is Edward. You probably have as many questions as I do, which is why I've already started the fire and put some water on to make tea later. My story is quite long but certainly interesting to hear. I'm a researcher by profession and mainly focus on Renaissance architecture. Architecture is my great love, and I'm fortunate to be able to study it extensively. But, as I was saying, my story is long. I would suggest you take a seat and ask your questions freely." Ed continues, "I think we'll be surprised by what we can tell each other." Oliver nods and looks at Isabella, then back at Ed, and says, "That's a great idea, Ed. This is Isabella, and my name is Oliver. We did plan to stay at the inn and were likely searching for you, but we had no idea who to expect." Oliver looks at Isabella and says, "Come, let's sit down so we can talk comfortably." Isabella looks at Edward and says, "Hello, Ed, it's quite remarkable to meet you here in an empty Hollowbrook. And a cup of tea would be quite welcome after the walk we've just had." Edward stands up from the table, walks over to the fire, grabs the kettle, and carries it to the kitchen to pour the boiling water into a large teapot. Edward looks around, and Oliver laughs, saying, "The tea is in the left cupboard." Edward laughs as well, retrieves the tea from the cupboard, and Oliver sets some cups on the table. He looks at Ed and says, "If I may ask, how did you end up here?" Ed looks at Oliver and responds, "Oliver, to put it briefly, essentially, in the same way you arrived here. You may be wondering how that's possible, but the device you're traveling with, like the watch, I have it exactly the same way. It's just hanging on a chain around my neck, as you can see." Edward continues, "You might have expected there to be only one watch, but that's not the case. I ended up in a very dark time thanks to the watch you have on your wrist. My father was a watchmaker by trade, and after his death, I found the watch in a cabinet in his study. The watch looked entirely different from the other watches in his study, and that's why, I think, it caught my attention. By now, the three of them have taken seats at a large table in the inn next to the fireplace." Edward continues with his story, saying, "The watch that Oliver has on his wrist brought me from my year 2713 to the year 635. It was a personal mishap of mine. I had been tinkering with the watch, thinking I could adjust the numbers as I pleased. When I thought I had the right button, I was suddenly surrounded by white light, and I found myself in a mountainous environment. To make a long story short, I was taken in by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. Later, Dionysius explained to me that I had arrived in Romania." Ed continues, "Luck was on my side because Dionysius was a mathematician, and we talked for hours. I still visit him occasionally. He is the one who invented the calendar system that we now use. It was meant to be that I ended up there. And when I mention a dark time, I mean I didn't understand how the watch worked, and I was frustrated that I was stuck. The region where I landed is called Scythia Minor and is a beautiful place to live. I spent a lot of time helping Dionysius with his work in the monastery and on the land, and in the evenings, I tried to figure out how the watch operated. Ed continues, because my father was a watchmaker, I was always able to watch and learn a lot. Watchmaking is one of my hobbies. Since I was stuck in the year 635 and didn't understand a watch, I had to open it using tools I had to make myself. It took a long time to find the right components. Once I had the watch open, the real trouble began. The mechanism and the small parts in the watch were made by true masters, and replicating them was extremely challenging. Dionysius was incredibly helpful, providing me with all the raw materials and materials available. With a serious tone, Ed goes on, saying, we couldn't figure it out. I could only manage to replicate a few parts. It was very disappointing. At one point, I decided to reassemble the watch and put everything aside for the time being. I couldn't make progress in replicating and understanding the watch that had brought me to the year 635, so I decided to focus on my work on the land. Ed looks at Oliver and Isabella and continues his story. I don't know how or why it happened, but after I reassembled the watch, a red button suddenly lit up. Without thinking, I pressed that button, and in a white flash, I was back in my own time as if nothing had happened. After, so to say, I had both feet back on the ground and had recovered from the shock, I immediately began to carefully disassemble the watch, as my father had taught me. I had learned from the watch by then that it could be used for time travel. It was a fantastic discovery that I kept secret from everyone. I was never allowed to snoop around in my father's study, and I've never been able to ask him if he knew how the watch worked. Ed takes a sip of his tea and says, I was ultimately able to replicate many components, but I don't think I got everything right. But, how do you actually do it? How do you know where you'll end up? Isabella looks admiringly at Ed and interjects, it's incredibly clever that you managed to rebuild the watch. Oliver looks at Ed and begins to explain, in the beginning, I had no idea what was happening to me either. I found this watch in a library here in Hollowbrook during my time in 2022. I've been to many places, and during my planned journeys, I found two other items that, when combined with the watch, allow for targeted time travel. Especially in the early period, I remember it being quite uncertain. Ultimately, Galileo explained to me how the watch works. Galileo had received the watch from his father, who had already made some modifications to it. Ed looks up and says, that's interesting to know. Galileo worked on it. I had a suspicion. Oliver nods and continues, in the beginning, I had no clue where I would end up. I didn't even know what was happening. But, before I go on, didn't we also encounter each other on a ship that later sank? Ed chuckles and says, indeed, that was me. I couldn't change the course of history. But I just wanted to take a look at that famous ship before it sank. I had known for a long time that it was going to sink, it was in the history books. But as I walked across the deck, I saw you with the watch on. I saw that you, too, were bewildered and looking around, so I approached you and warned you about what the ship's future held. You briefly saw me for a second time when you stood in front of the building before it collapsed. I flashed myself away just before it happened, and when I returned, I saw that part of the building had collapsed, but you were already safe back in the inn. The third time we encountered each other in this town, I warned you to keep an eye on your belongings. I was time traveling and had long realized that I didn't always have appropriate clothing on. It led to some strange situations. But I understand from you that you need 3 things to work with the watch, right? Oliver nods and says, indeed, with the watch come the celestial maps, and using those maps, you can navigate through time. How did you manage that, then? Because you didn't have the maps. Ed responds, saying, I simply made up a place I wanted to go to each time and programmed it into the watch. That's how I've seen many different countries and the various ways houses and buildings are constructed. But, Oliver, you're talking about maps, that does make navigation a lot easier. I have so many questions, but how did you find those maps? Oliver responds, if you want to have access to all the maps of the universe, you also need the key, and I acquired it during my travels. It's too much to tell all at once. But before we continue, would you perhaps like a Mars sandwich from the year 4361? Ed's eyes widen in amazement and he bursts into laughter, saying, "Now that's something. Yes, I would definitely like a Mars sandwich. But how naive of me. During my time travels, I only went back in the past. I never even thought about traveling to the future. What a story. But please, tell me, have you really been to Mars?" Isabella answers as Oliver places the sandwiches on the table. To be precise, we arrived at a space observation station floating in space next to Mars, so to speak. Later, we went to Mars with the people who received us there. The people live underground on Mars. It was truly remarkable. We spent the night in their apartment on Mars. It's almost unimaginable. Ed says, by the year 2901, people were well on their way to settling on Mars, but it's fantastic to hear that they don't just visit Mars, they live there. Wonderful, progress at its finest. Ed is now looking at the stack of enticing sandwiches that Oliver has placed on the table. And Oliver says, "Please, help yourselves, they taste delicious." Ed looks at Isabella and says, "Ladies first." Isabella picks up a sandwich, takes a bite, and says, "We've had sandwiches from Olympia in 776 BC, but these are quite tasty too. Real Martian sandwiches." They all laugh and happily bite into the Martian sandwiches. Oliver continues, "The Martian sandwiches are made with astro bread, topped with space lettuce, galactic Gouda cheese, cosmic vegetables, and a touch of rocket mayo." Ed nods in approval and says, "I ate very well at Dionysius's place." "But indeed, Isabella, what delightful sandwiches you've brought." Ed goes on, saying, "I got the first real watch, the one you have on your wrist, working back then, but I couldn't quite replicate it. A part of the mechanism remained unfamiliar to me. I couldn't read it in one of my computers. But now I understand that the watch can do much more than you might expect." Oliver then explains, "The watch has a memory, and in that memory, there are locations stored of people who lost the watch or deliberately abandoned it because they were content in the time they were transported to. It's fascinating to see it all this way. But one of those memory spots was in 1574 in Leiden, the Netherlands, and that's where I met Isabella. She has been traveling with me ever since to find all the people transported to a different time by the watch." Oliver looks from Isabella to Ed and says, "This is how we found you as well. I had the opportunity to return to my own time once I understood how the watch worked. But I've set the goal of traveling to all the locations stored in the watch with Isabella to see what we find, and we're making good progress, I must say." Edward looks at his teacup and with his second sandwich in hand, he says, "It's incredibly special that you've come to find me. I never knew about the memory locations in the watch. I have to admit, I find it quite convenient. I'll start adding memory locations to my watch, it seems very handy indeed." "But Oliver, how many memory locations does your watch actually have?" Oliver laughs and says, "I understand that this watch has 8 filled memory locations. But I believe you can program many more places into it." Edward says, "These sandwiches are truly heavenly." He chuckles and continues, "The watch I have on my wrist is used to travel to times I know. As I mentioned, I never knew about the memory locations in the watch or that there are people stuck in other times. I never really thought about it. The whole watch remains an incredible story. But we're jumping from one question to another. It's wonderful that you're going through the memory locations in the watch to rescue people who are stuck. Have you succeeded with a few people already? I mean, do you need help finding those people?" Oliver responds, "That's very kind of you, Ed. All the travels have gone well so far, although I've met some extraordinary people and gods during my travels. So, I understand that you've never seen the celestial maps." Ed nods and says, "I've never heard of the celestial maps, let alone seen them." Oliver continues to explain, saying, "In Japan, we met a Scotsman named Lachlan, and he had heard a folk singer mention the celestial maps in his village in Scotland. But that's not really relevant. I'll get the maps out, and then you can see what we're talking about and how we can get a rough idea of where we'll end up because we have to locate the next person. The individuals whose positions are stored in the watch's memory are called the watchers. Oliver takes a small wooden box from his bag and places it on the table. He takes the leaf-shaped key from his pocket, opens the box, and the room fills with a soft blue glow. The celestial maps appear to float in the room. The 8 maps gently hover around them, and Ed looks on in amazement. After a few moments, Ed, with his hand over his mouth in astonishment, says, "I never knew. This is truly beautiful to see." Isabella and Oliver look at each other and share a smile. Oliver then says, "What do you think, Ed? These are the 8 maps of the universe, and we can practically look through all dimensions. It depends on where we want to look or travel to. I still find this truly remarkable. When I first got hold of these maps, I didn't know where to look or what I could actually do with them. Galileo taught me a lot, and I'm incredibly grateful to him. I think even the monk Dionysius would love to see these maps." Ed still gazes in amazement at the maps and says, "I'm not quite sure what to say. The watch is fantastic. It's hard to grasp that you can travel through time with it, but these maps are even more special, I believe. It must have been an incredible feat to condense the entire universe into 8 maps." Oliver points to a glowing area on a map to the right of the table and says, "Do you see that illuminated spot there, Ed? That's our current position. It's hard to grasp when you look around because there are many glowing stars and squares. But everything is visible on these maps, they hold no secrets. On the map behind you, you can see a ship flying through the air. That's the Flying Dutchman I sailed on, where I also met Zeus, Hera, and Poseidon. On the map to the left behind Isabella, next to the red planet, you can see a bright point, which is the research center outside Mars where we just came from. And to keep it simple, on the map behind me, you should see a position now." While saying this, Oliver presses a button on the watch, and indeed, all the stars, planets, and glowing spots on the map behind him change position, with a violet-colored square blinking in the center. "That's our next watcher," says Oliver, and he looks at his watch and says, "The next watcher is in the year 1871 in California. It's a unique time because the gold rush was happening. What I mean to say is, just like Leyden in the 16th century, besieged by the Spaniards, wasn't safe, but if we want to meet the next watcher, we have to go to the time of the Wild West. So, there are 1,001 possibilities of where we could end up. This could get quite exciting." Isabella says, "Oh, Oliver, when we traveled to Japan, we also didn't know where we would end up, and the same goes for our trip to Mars. I must admit, the Wild West does sound intriguing. I would actually love to take a look there, even though it's during a turbulent time." Ed, with wide eyes, looks from Isabella to Oliver and to the maps and says, "This is truly incredible. California in 1871, how did you come up with that? But, I'm not sure how I could be of help, but I'd like to travel with you. With the 3 of us, we might learn more once we're there." Oliver looks at Isabella and nods to Ed, saying, "Maybe that's a good idea. In any case, I'd like to have another cup of tea and a sandwich, and then we can take another look at the maps and make a good plan. But Ed, before we continue, I'm curious about where you've been and why you distanced yourself from the original watch." Ed says, "I lost the original watch during a fall when it slipped from my wrist, and I almost lost my life. It was a close call. I had transported myself to Mount Everest to see who would reach the summit first. Once I reached the top, I slipped and fell a considerable distance. I got caught behind a rocky outcrop but lost the watch there. Because I had my copy of the watch hanging around my neck, I could press the return button with one hand and didn't get to witness how they conquered Everest. In the end, I was glad to be back, as it was bitterly cold up there on that mountain." Ed continues, "I can laugh about it now, but when I was sliding down, I thought differently." Ed goes on with his story, saying, "I've been to many places. Because I love guitars, I've been to many famous music festivals. Name a guitarist, and I've seen them live. But I've also observed other historical events from a distance. For example, I saw the Battle of Waterloo just outside of Waterloo and also saw, and, frankly, experienced a bit too closely, how the Normandy landings on D-Day unfolded. Over the years, I've been to many places in many times. I've returned to the Titanic regularly, just before the moment the ship would sink. The last time I was there, I found you on the deck. Ed continues, it was fascinating for me to see that you were wearing the watch I lost high in the mountains, and that you found it here in the Hollowbrook library. What an incredible journey the watch has had. Someone could write a book about it. I've been to beautiful places, but in different times. It was very interesting to see how architecture developed in various locations. And I must admit that I have my favorite restaurants here on Earth, but also in different times. And all three of them burst into laughter. Ed goes on to ask, but to get back to the so-called next watcher. California in the 19th century? Well, we should at least bring a water bottle because I believe it's always sunny there. What's your plan of action? Oliver looks at Isabella and says, we usually bring some food with us and think about the clothing people wore during that time so that we don't stand out too much. But, so far, that's always failed, but we've still ended up in the right place. Oliver laughs and adds, when I think back to the time when we wanted to time travel to Greece, we had brought some sheets to wrap around ourselves. Isabella also laughs and says, I was stuck in the 16th century in Leiden, and you appeared there in jeans. Oliver, nobody had ever seen that. Isabella continues, I think it's a good idea to stay here overnight and embark on our journey well rested in the morning. Oliver nods in agreement with Isabella and then looks at Ed, asking, what do you think, Ed? Ed says, that's a good idea. If you both stay in the inn, I'll flash back to my home in the year 2713, get some rest there, pick up the last things I want to take, and then I'll see you tomorrow morning right here outside the inn in the sun. Is that a good plan? Oliver says, that sounds like a great plan, Ed. I'm not sure what you want to take with you, but it sounds like a good idea. And I could use some rest as well. Ed stands up from the table, taking one more look at the celestial maps floating around the room, and says, Dear Oliver and Isabella, it's been fantastic to have met you. We'll continue our conversation tomorrow morning. I wish you both a good night, and I'll see you here tomorrow morning. With a slight bow, he presses a button on the watch hanging around his neck, and in a second, Ed disappears. Isabella and Oliver look at each other in amazement. Isabella says, he's just going home. She chuckles and adds, that's actually quite a funny idea. But tonight, we'll stay here. I find this inn quite cozy. Dear listeners, here in the inn in Hollowbrook, we're allowing Oliver and Isabella to get some well-deserved rest. Together with Edward, they have a plan to travel to California in the year 1871 to see who they will encounter there. Thank you for listening, and please like and subscribe so you won't miss out on Oliver the Time Traveler. Till the next one.